Well, October is Mental Health Awareness Month, and this year the focus is on suicide prevention. According to the World Health Organization, every 40 seconds someone loses their life to suicide. Well, now to engage further, we are now joined in studio by Lamprecht, the Advocacy and Manager and Child Protection Specialist, Women and Men Against Child Abuse. A very good afternoon to you, sir. We thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Essentially, how do we actually deal with the stigma that's around mental health?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to be having conversations about what mental health means and what ill health looks like. You know, there's been a lot of push for people to be healthier, get fitter, eat better. All of that contributes to general wellness. But when we talk about mental health, very often men feel that for them to be mentally unhealthy is a sign of some form of weakness, rather than a vulnerability that we all have from the very, very high demands that are placed on us at the moment. So I think that to try and give men a way to talk about their mental health needs to be a big focus during mental health month, because we don't have the conversations. As your introduction said, they drink their problems away and fight them away, and it leads to enormous problems.
Now, having a look at men specifically in the South African context, and I'll narrow it down into the African context, where it seems as though there seems to be some sort of an even bigger stigma against mental health, specifically on cultural barriers. For example, from the African perspective, there's no such thing. People wouldn't necessarily have believed if you say that you're suffering from mental illness, and they're very, very quick to use the words crazy.
So I think we need to understand that mental ill health is a continuum, and people are very afraid of people who are what we call psychotic. So in other words, they hear voices, or there's something telling them to do something. And from a cultural perspective, what's also been interesting is the link between spirituality and mental health, and the interpretation of being called and spoken to by ancestors rather than being mentally unwell. So ironically, there's actually been a little bit more of an acceptance of some of the very, very serious psychiatric symptoms and giving them a more spiritual base. We then go through what we call personality disorders, and those are people like psychopaths or borderline personality disorders, and those people generally had a very bad past. And they never learned how to relate. They don't know how to care about another person's feelings. And then the one we're really struggling with at the moment is obviously the depression and anxiety, which we all suffer at some level. So I think to give people the right words to talk about it is the beginning of every conversation.
But also, more importantly, knowing that there's different levels, I suppose, of depression and anxiety. So break that down in terms of it being something that was being caused by something, a traumatic experience, and possibly it being hereditary.
Yeah. So there's three basic things that make up your personality. So the first is your genetics. The other is your environment. We sort of call it nature, nurture. And then there's some mythical elements that we call temperament. And from those three, what builds up in the person is the ability, we call it resilience, but your ability to basically cope in certain ways with life. And when those coping mechanisms are put under stress through trauma, through possibly a genetic predisposition, or just quite frankly living under the kind of extreme pressure of trying to find a job, trying to provide for your family, trying to make sure that you provide sufficiently, holding that all together, sometimes people, their coping mechanisms are just not quite enough, and then they can fall into either what we call a reactive depression, so something's happened and now become depressed, or a depression that is more from an hereditary level. And depression is about not feeling anything. It's not about being sad. Okay, so when people are sad, they're appropriately sad. You lose family members, you might lose your child, you might lose a parent. It's appropriate to be sad because you've lost. Depression is more like I don't feel anymore. So it's a loss of the enjoyment and the ability to engage in the world. And then to die sometimes feels like nothing. So I think it's the emptiness that we really struggle with, that almost that what is the purpose that my life holds, and when that purpose becomes difficult, then the emotions become difficult.
Now, in terms of identification, going into your adult phase, you're able to vocate what you're feeling or what you're not feeling. If we have a look at children, How essentially do we pick up that a child is depressed? Do children get depressed? What are the signs to look for?
Oh, children absolutely get depressed. So what you are looking for is you are looking for an extreme change. That can happen over a period of time, or it can happen very suddenly. So for example, a child is normally outgoing, they are normally quite jovial, they eat properly, they've got a good sleep routine, and all of that starts going upside down. So their marks at school may drop, they may isolate themselves in their rooms, not go out and enjoy their friends. And the other things that happen is their sleeping and eating is often disrupted, because with the chemicals that go wrong in the body, they either sleep too much, lots of teenagers sleep a lot, so that's not but they either sleep too much or they can't sleep at all, or they eat too much or they can't eat at all, because the whole rhythm of the body is out.
Okay, and then is there a link that we're starting to see with the inclusion of the fourth industrial revolution, specifically of social media and depression?
I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, like everything. So the one thing is that there's an enormous amount of information available, so that you can go and look and say, this is what I'm feeling. You can find stuff on it. The danger of it, I mean, for example, I was referred a young woman, she was 12 years old, grade 7, and she had joined an online suicide pact group where they would take photos of themselves, what they looked like dead, and they would share them with each other all over the world. Yeah, so the problem with the internet is there's just no filter on it. So in other words, you can go and Google the South African Depression Anxiety Support Group and get really good information on how to cope with depression, or you can end up in suicide cults via your social media platforms.
Sure, that's very, very shocking. So in terms of this, it's October, it is Mental Health Awareness Month. What is Women and Men Against Child Abuse going to be embarking on throughout the course of this month?
Look, our main drive is for children who are in very vulnerable positions. So what we are going to be doing is we're going to be following court cases. We've just been referred one case from Pretoria where a child was tied up and shot at by men, and now she's too terrified to go and testify. So we'll go and stand there and we'll support her. We're going to be in court for some cases where coaches abused children, so we're there to support the families. So our big drive in the advocacy is to support people where adverse things have happened to them, to show that they're not stigmatized, and we will be there literally holding their hands through the process of the courts, which itself can be extremely traumatic.
Now, through that facilitation and through that process, what sort of support do you get as an organization, both from the community at large, the victims, and of course the state?
Okay, so we live in a country that has limitless needs with limited resources, so it's the non-profit sector is always battling for money. But we do have a good relationship with social development who provide some funding, and then we have got some very strong corporate partners and law firm partners that we work with, because we need legal advice, we need financial assistance, we need people to help us manage the finances, because it is, I mean, behind the scenes you have to run a business, pay staff. So we've got some good support, but I mean, we could always use more, because literally the needs are limitless. We get cases every day, and any increase in resource will allow us to assist more children.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. October, Mental Health Awareness Month, and of course this year was focusing on suicide prevention. We were in talks just now with Luke Lamprecht, the Advocacy Manager and Child Protection Specialist from Women and Men Against Child Abuse, just giving us some more information around what the month entails, some of the stigma that has been centered around mental health, specifically amongst men, of course, the activities that will be embarked on. We're going to take a short break. Do stay